Welcome to World Religions. This is a series of video lectures intended to accompany a one-semester World Religions survey class. In particular, I'm basing the lectures on this textbook called A Short Introduction to World Religions, which is edited by Christopher Partridge and published by Fortress Press. It is a pretty good textbook that gives you good value for the money. As of the current recording, it's about half the price of Oxford University Press's textbook that does a similar thing, for instance. So, part one of our lectures are going to be on the general topic of understanding religion, and there's going to be several chapters in this overall part or section. Chapter one is how to define religion. We can begin by looking at the etymology or word history of the English word religion. This comes from the Latin word religio, which is from the verb religare, which means to tie something together tightly. The second part of the word ligare is to bind or tie. And the first part, re, is a prefix that means again or back again. So a couple of different meanings are suggested by this etymology. Religion is often regarded as binding a group of people together through shared rituals and beliefs and values and through sacrifices or costs that people bear together. The picture on the slide is of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius sacrificing in front of a temple to Jupiter in the city of Rome. And so that's one meaning suggested by this etymology of religion, binding people together through their actions. Another meaning that's often taken from this etymology is binding religious people to God or to some other sacred beings that they worship. The chapter we're looking at, which is authored by Russell T. McCutcheon, a Canadian religious studies scholar, gives in passing a definition of religion. But the main point of this chapter is actually not to argue for this or another particular definition, but rather to just lay out the general issue or topic of how scholars have tried to define religion in the past. And so he offers three different types of definitions or theories of religion and discusses the strengths and weaknesses of each, essentially. But he does, in passing, give this particular definition of religion as well, so I want to unpack it a little bit. He says that religion is beliefs, behaviors, and social institutions which have something to do with speculations on any of the following. So it's going to be a list of different properties that you can find in a religion. Number one, speculations about the origin and significance of the universe. So we would generally classify this as cosmology, a theory of the universe, or cosmogony, a theory of the origin or beginning of the universe, or eschatology, a theory of the end of the universe. Now, strictly speaking, eschatology applies more directly to the afterlife of an individual person, but it is sometimes used in this other sense as well for a theory of the end of the universe. So what McCutcheon is basically doing with his proposed definition is listing properties that a religion can have without insisting that the religion must have it. So in other words, these would not technically be necessary properties that every religion must have. It's a little bit unclear in his wording whether he regards them as sufficient properties. That is, if something has this, it's enough or sufficient to be a religion. But at the very least, they are salient, important, or suggestive properties. So he would probably say at least that the more of these things a religion has, the more of these things some social phenomenon has, the more likely it is to be a religion. The second property he suggests is theories or speculations about what happens after death. So that would relate to eschatology in the usual sense. Third property he suggests is the existence and wishes of powerful non-human beings, such as spirits, ancestors, angels, demons, and gods. So, in other words, a belief in the supernatural, and specifically supernatural persons. These are human-like entities that are conscious, have goals, can choose to perform a certain action based on reasons, things like that. And then the last property he suggests is speculations on how presumably any or all of this shapes human behavior. So this could include things like moral codes, perhaps, that were commanded by gods, or just what are the implications of the origin or end of the universe for human behavior. So I think it's a pretty good definition of religion. As we'll see, there's a lot of different theories out there on offer. And it's hard to define religion in a way that's decisive or universally accepted by scholars. And this may be because it is what is called a family resemblance concept, something that by its very nature can't be defined in terms of essential properties. Well, we'll get back to that concept in a few minutes. This is my favorite way of defining religion, listing salient or suggestive properties. And the more of these that a religion has, the more of these a given social phenomenon has, the more likely it is to be a religion. Uh, this is not necessarily an absolute list. So there's probably a few things I'm forgetting, or maybe some of these shouldn't be on the list. But like McCutcheon's definition, if we go through these, we'll get at least additional insight into the common properties that religions have. So I'll go through each of these terms and briefly define them, and then use Christianity just as an example. So sacred is something that has meaning or value that transcends ordinary meaning or ordinary value. And it's generally interpreted in terms of what philosophers would call lexically prior value, or value that's categorically greater than non-sacred value. And the idea of this kind of value is that you cannot trade off the sacred for the non-sacred, the sacred for what's usually called the profane. So no amount of money, for example, would suffice to induce a sane and moral person to sacrifice their child. This could be another example of a sacred value. So even if someone offered you $1 billion, hopefully you wouldn't, and you definitely morally shouldn't, give them your child to kill or do whatever they wanted to. So life, particularly the life of a person you have a relationship of obligation to, seems sacred vis-a-vis money or other types of profane value. So in religion, you generally see a god, a person, an object could be that has a place, a time that has this type of sacred value. I'll just use Christianity as an example. This picture on the slide is from a Catholic Mass. We could point to several sacred things in here, including the person of Jesus, who's regarded as God by Christians, and as being of transcendently greater value um, than other particular things in the creation, for example. And also the communion host, the little wafer that the priest is holding up to the altar, that is believed by Catholics to be the living body of Jesus, of God. And so that would also be something of sacred value. The second property, supernatural, this basically just means not natural or going beyond the natural. Now, it's a bit tricky to define because natural has a lot of different meanings, but the most relevant sense in the context of religion is religious people have beliefs that there are beings or things that can violate the usual laws of nature as they're observed by human senses and understood or analyzed by scientists. And so the supernatural beings or whatever would violate or at least be inexplicable in terms of the normal scientific laws or natural laws that seem to ordinarily govern the world. A third salient property of religion is myth. So religions usually have stories called myths, or they could just be called stories or histories, but they correspond to the concept of myth, and that myths, unlike normal stories or histories or scientific theories, they're not only focused on recording facts or things that are literally accurate or true. They may be doing that, but the main point of them is to focus on expressing meaning and value. And so it's about the significance, the meaning of the story for the life of an individual human or the life of the community. Symbol, this is using one thing to suggest or express another meaning. So to give an example from the Catholic Mass in the picture, different Christians interpret the Mass or the communion or the Eucharist in different ways. Some actually regard the communion host, the wafer, the bread, as just a symbolic memory of Jesus's Last Supper. In Catholicism, they believe in the real presence, so God is supposed to be literally present there. But even then, in this particular example, there's probably levels of symbolic meaning going on as well. So even if it's literally true, not just symbolic, that God is in the wafer, why choose a wafer for the embodiment? That may have symbolic meaning to it, that humans consume God. So when you consume food, normally you ingest it, it's very intimate, and you digest it, it becomes a part of your body. So arguably there's at least something symbolic going on in the communion wafer itself, even in Catholicism specifically. Ritual. So religions almost always have fixed sequences of behaviors, often performed by groups of people, not always, that have a meaning or purpose. And it could be partly a symbolic meaning. Usually it would be in a ritual. It could connect you to a sacred reality. It could relate or invoke a supernatural being. So that's another thing to keep in mind with these properties of religion. I haven't stated it on the slides, but typically if what you're looking at is a religion, it will have these properties and they will kind of interact with each other as well. Sacrifice. This is giving up something of great value, or at least of significant value, as a sign of commitment. So you'll notice a theme, a pattern. If you look at world religions, they often involve sacrificing something. Like in the picture of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, he was leading I think it was a bull to sacrifice at that temple of Jupiter in the Capitoline Hill in Rome. But there are other valuable things that can be given up as a sign of commitment, usually a commitment to the sacred value or values honored by the religion. Now, in the case of Christianity, it's a little bit interesting. I mean, they do sacrifice things in Christianity. There can be other types of sacrifice apart from animals or objects. It could be giving something up. So if you give up eating meat during Lent, that's another type of sacrifice. But even in the central Christian ceremony of communion, it's a kind of inverted sacrifice in a weird way, which I think also relates to the symbolic value of the communion ceremony because it's God in the form of the host being offered up as a sacrifice to God. And now's not really the time to discuss the meaning of that. I mean, Christians would interpret it in different ways, but it shows you that even the Christian communion does have that form of a sacrifice, even though there's something more symbolic or deeper going on there as well. So giving up something to God, that's a common form of sacrifice you see in religion. Morality. So genuine religions, and this is one of the useful ways you can use to distinguish them from things that are kind of like religion, uh, but don't match it specifically. Like, for example, spiritualism involves belief in ghosts and seances to summon or communicate with the ghosts. So they have rituals, they have beliefs in the supernatural. Um, Spiritualism may not have as much of a robust view of the sacred or of myths or of sacrifice. And another thing that's not usually a part of the practice of spiritualism is a specific moral code. So most religious communities have views about what you should and shouldn't do. That would be a view of the right as part of morality. Right is a moral value relating to action. And then also they would usually have views about the good and virtue as well. This is a way of dividing up morality that's often used by philosophers, which is why I'm using it. The good is something of moral value, and it relates to what your goals should be. Virtue is a moral value relating to a disposition or a habit of behavior of a person, such as the virtue of courage, or the virtue of honesty, or the virtue of generosity. And rightness has to do with action, which is what we usually perhaps think about when we're thinking about morality, right and wrong, what you should or shouldn't do, and so on. So all religions are going to have views about these things, including sometimes, not always, but sometimes codified lists of what you're allowed to do, like the commandments in Judaism and Christianity, for example. Social. So religion can involve individuals doing things on their own. A salient example of that would be a religious hermit who practices renunciation, may perform prayer or other rituals, honoring God, for example, on their own. But religions generally have a social aspect and a strong social aspect as well. So people performing rituals together, people making sacrifices in a way that's witnessed by others so they can see them giving up that valuable thing. Communities of people enforcing the rules of the religion's morality. So you do tend to see that strong social aspect to religion. And finally, mysticism. So mysticism can be a bit tricky to define, but a simple way of thinking of it is related to experiences of self-transcendence, where an individual person goes beyond their usual sense of self. There's typically a weakening or sometimes a complete obliteration of the sense of separation between self and world, or self and God, or self and object, or self and other people. And there's often an experience of union, either with God, another sacred being, or maybe just something supernatural, even if it's not thought of as sacred. There could be gods or spirits that aren't sacred. Maybe they're neutral, maybe they're evil, like demons, but they could still be involved in mystical experiences as long as there is a weakening or alteration of the usual sense of the self. Arguably, it would count as a mystical experience. People could quibble about the definition. If you're possessed by a demon, for example, is that the same type of experience as when you unite with God? I mean, obviously there's differences, but a broad definition of mysticism, and this would cover a large number of religions, is people experiencing either unprovoked or deliberately cultivated these changes in the usual sense of the self and the usual experience of the world. And they're often interpreted in terms of coming into contact with another being, another person, usually something supernatural. The textbook mentions a few different terms used to refer to the study of religion. In English, it's usually just called religious studies. The term comparative religion can also be used, although the latter has the more specific connotation of a strategy for understanding religions more by systematically comparing and contrasting them. In German, the term is Religionswissenschaft, or the science, Wissenschaft, of religion. And in French, similarly, les sciences de religion. I think that's about how you pronounce it, which it's in the plural, so that's interesting. It suggests there could be multiple sciences of religions. And in the English language literature as well, religious studies is usually thought of as involving multiple fields, multiple separate academic disciplines like psychology, anthropology, sociology, archaeology, and history. And this is significant because it's the usual methodology of religious studies scholars to try to be interdisciplinary, at least to an extent. So they might be trained in one field, but it would usually be considered, good practice to get insights from other fields as well, other sources of evidence that relate to religion. So, for example, even if someone is, I don't know, a psychologist or just a cultural studies person, they might use archaeology in order to assist their understanding of religion, such as archaeological studies of the site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is believed to be the oldest stone monumental structure that people made, or at least that we're aware of. And it also appears to be of a ritual or religious site. And so that's just an example of how archaeology is going to be very useful in the study of religion, even by people of other fields like sociology or psychology, for example. The textbook distinguishes between three main types of theories of religion. There's a little bit maybe of fuzziness or sloppiness around the edges of their classification because some of the theories they discuss may not be trying to give a definitional theory of religion per se. They may be just trying to elucidate some aspect of religion. But regardless of that, this division into three different types of theories is useful for understanding different attempts to define religion. So we're going to go with it. The first type is called essentialist theories of religion. And these are theories that try to define religion in terms of one or more essential properties. What is an essential property? Well, that would be a property that is either necessary or sufficient, or both, condition for being a type of thing. So, for example, the essential properties of being a triangle are being a three-sided polygon. So if you're a polygon and if you're three-sided, then you're a triangle. They're each of those properties, being three-sided and being a polygon, those are individually necessary for being a triangle. And then together or jointly, they're sufficient, they're enough to count as a triangle if you have both of those properties. Similarly, if you look at some scientific concepts like the chemical elements, things like hydrogen, helium, gold, and so on, each of those could be defined in terms of essential properties. So their atomic number, which is the number of protons in the nucleus, if you know that number, that is both necessary and sufficient for counting as a particular type of element. So atomic number 1 is the essential property of being hydrogen. And atomic number 2, 2 protons in the nucleus, is the essential property of being helium, and so on. So these theories of religion try to give this complete, logically complete definition of religion in terms of necessary or sufficient conditions. And if you look at the history of philosophy, to a certain extent, this was often the assumption that for most things, maybe all things, you can define them in this way. There's been pushback against this idea of essentialism in more recent decades, I guess you could say. And I do think it doesn't probably work completely when you try to apply it to religion. But nevertheless, with each of these essentialist theories, you can probably get at least some insight into the nature of religion by just listening to what they have to say. Now, one thing that's a little bit odd about the textbook here, in discussing examples of essentialist theories of religion, it only includes those that focus on the inner experience of religious people. But strictly speaking, the way the word essentialism is usually used, at least in philosophy, it's not necessarily pointing to something inner. This is probably reflecting the way that essentialism is being used by a lot of social scientists who are religious studies scholars. But essentialism can be inner, outer, it can be anything as long as it's a set of necessary or sufficient conditions. However, I do think, even though this is probably a bit of a logical error in the textbook, it's totally true that most theorists who've tried to give an essentialist theory of religion, they do point to inner experience factors. For example, the picture of the man on the slide, Rudolf Otto, he defined religion largely, if not entirely, in terms of das Heilige, the holy in German. So he thought of that as the essence of religion, and in particular, it seems that he was thinking in terms of the phenomenology or the inner experience of religious people. Essentialists about religion often contrast the public expression aspect of religion from the inner belief or experience aspect of the religion. Um, and they may even say that the word religion typically names the outer behavior, but their belief would usually be that the inner experience or belief is what is most important for understanding the nature of religion. So maybe faith, for example, is the essence of religion. There could be other suggestions, though, for these essentialist theories. Common ones would include the sacred and the holy. So Rudolf Otto, I already mentioned the example of Das Heilige. That would be his view of the inner essence of religion. And the idea here is that you can use that as the sole criterion for whether something counts as a religion. You'd probably phrase it something like this: if people experience the holy, then that is both necessary and sufficient for whatever they're doing to count as a religion or part of a religion. So that would be the strategy that is used by these essentialist theories of religion. And they would acknowledge that there are social institutions outside of the personal experience of faith, belief, sacred, the holy, etc., that are associated with the religion, but they would regard them as merely secondary and inessential. So literally that means that even if the social institutions didn't exist, as long as that inner criterion were there, such as an experience of the holy, the thing you're looking at would still count as a religion. And another interesting corollary that the textbook draws about this essentialist type of theory of religion, specifically the ones giving the essence of religion as an inner experience rather than something else, is that the essence of religion is real, but because it's an inner experience, it's not directly observable by researchers, by outsiders, by scientists. Now, I'm not sure the claim that it defies study is going to be true. Even if something is not directly observable, it doesn't mean that it's not observable at all. It may have observable correlates, for example. Like, who knows, maybe when someone is experiencing the holy within, you can look at their brain and check it out and say, yep, that's the holy they're experiencing. So you could verify it uh, externally as well. Um, and another last warning about these essentialist theories of religion: even though they do identify core properties of religion like faith, the sacred, the holy, it's a bit odd that they're only focusing on the inner. There could be other essentialist theories that have a mix or a combination of the inner aspects of religion and the outer that would still count as essentialist theories logically. They still could have a list of properties that are individually necessary and jointly sufficient for being a religion. A second type of definitional theory of religion is functionalist theories. These see religion as a social institution that plays a role in helping individuals or groups survive and reproduce themselves. This doesn't have to be only biological survival, it could also be cultural survival and reproduction. But the idea is it's helping an individual, a group, or both do well in life. And it could include psychological wellness, it could include material wealth or power. There could be various types of benefits the individual or the group is getting from the religion. So, for example, the site of Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known stone monument made by humans, we don't, know for sure what function it served, but a common view that you hear is that because it involved the labor of so many people, uh, thousands at the very least, it could be a way of coordinating larger groups of people together. When you have people come together from maybe different villages, for example, to work on a common project, you're going to create a type of solidarity or bonding, just sort of through the means of human psychology, if nothing else. And thus, you might enable a larger scale or scope of cooperation, which might conceivably enable the people in those villages to better flourish if they're, cooperating with each other rather than fighting over land or other resources. So, this is somewhat speculative, obviously, but it gives an example of a possible function that religion could serve and that could fit in with a functionalist definitional theory of religion. One example of a functionalist theory of religion is that of Karl Marx. He called religion the opium, that is, the drug of the masses. He also called it the sigh of the oppressed creature. So he thought of religion as being a ploy used by the ruling class to help deceive and control those that they ruled, because he's thinking especially of religions like Christianity, which give a hope of an afterlife and promise a divine justice, perhaps in the later condition of this world or perhaps in an afterlife, which will correct whatever material injustices exist in the world. Even though Marx's view of religion seems mainly negative, by calling something a sigh of an oppressed creature, it does imply that it could give at least psychological comfort to the lower oppressed classes in society. One potential limitation of this theory of religion is that religion does exist as well, not only in societies with a great deal of inequality, but also in egalitarian societies. So if you look at a lot of ancient human societies, hunter-gatherers, hunter-foragers, some nomadic societies, there may not be a very sharp class distinction between different people. Hunter-forager societies in particular are usually highly egalitarian, and they have a bunch of norms for trying to ensure equality. And yet, they still usually are religious. They have forms of animism or spirit worship. So, with all of these theories of religion, there are going to be things that they get wrong or leave out. There's going to be weaknesses as well as strengths. So, the heart of Marx's theory of religion is not just the psychological comfort it gives to some people who are being exploited, but rather religion is invented or at least serves the interest of the ruling class. So, these are the ones that own the capital, the productive property, the property that lets you create wealth. And the idea is of Marx is that this is just a small fraction of the society and they don't want to share the wealth with other people. So, in order to get the other people to accept their state of being exploited by not having a share in the ownership of capital, they invent or they at least make use of religion, which gives hope in an afterlife. And it will cause people to accept their current lot of being exploited and not demand better treatment. Another aspect of Marx's view of religion is that it gives the locus of control over to God. So people might say, if they're religious, well, this is an injustice, but it's in God's hands. I'm not going to do anything to fight it. God will sort it out. And thus it prevents people from being active in the world to try to end the exploitation, to end the injustice. Now, I will say this, in addition to not really covering egalitarian societies, Marx's theory of religion um, doesn't seem to be totally accurate with regards to the locus of control claim either. Certainly, there are some religious behaviors that probably externalize locus of control to God or other supernatural beings. But if you think about the purpose of a lot of religious rituals, for example, many of them appear to be attempts to assert or gain control. So if you perform a sacrifice in a ritual, if you offer this valuable thing to God or some other being, the expectation is usually they will give you something in return. You will gain something. So religion also seems to be used by people to try to gain a sense of internal locus of control. Now, Marx would probably still say, well, this is illusory. It's not real control, right? You think you're going to get something in return, but you're not. So maybe it's distracting you from actually taking a control of material injustice. Even there, I think it's a bit more complex or nuanced. At least historically, it seems like religion has inspired people to fight for social justice in a material sense in this world, in this life, and so on. So just something to keep in mind as we're going through these theories. Most of them are going to get at least some things right, but they're going to have some limitations as well. Another functionalist theory of religion is that of Emile Durkheim, regarded as one of the founders of sociology and social science generally. So Durkheim especially emphasized that religious beliefs and practices enable individuals to form a shared social identity. So for him, the function or the purpose of religion is to create social identity. And then there could be various benefits to the group and maybe to the individuals as well that flow from that. And this could explain the aspects of religion where you have these group or communal rituals, people coming together. Maybe they're singing together, maybe they're chanting or dancing together, maybe they're circumambulating or walking around a sacred object together, etc. And these things help them to form a shared social identity. A third type of functionalist theory of religion is that of the psychologist Sigmund Freud. Whereas Marx thought of religion as fulfilling a function mainly for the ruling class because it helps them dominate the people they rule. And Durkheim thought of the function of religion as something that could benefit all of society or society as a unit. Freud thought of religion as something that benefited an individual psychologically. So religion is a coping mechanism. A religious person believes that God serves as their heavenly father who will protect them and guide them and so on, just as their actual parent may have done when they were younger. Freud also thought that religion helps people vent their antisocial anxieties in a way that's non-threatening to their place within the group. So they can do a little venting, maybe calm themselves psychologically, but not disrupt their fitting in with the rest of the group or their place in the social hierarchy. And presumably, Freud would have also thought that religion doesn't really necessarily harm the group. It doesn't benefit it. It's mainly an individual psychological thing, but it doesn't harm the group either. Now, limitations of Freud's theory. Keep in mind that not all religions believe in an all-powerful God who acts as a heavenly father. That's true of monotheistic religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and others. But if you look at, for example, animism, belief in a lot of spirits, including spirits of nature, they may not believe that there's a spirit that's always going to be there to protect them, always going to be there to help them. There's a bunch of individual spirits that you have different relationships with. Some of them will help you, some of them may harm you. And that last point also shows another limitation of Freud's religion, in that there are aspects of religion that do seem to function as coping mechanisms for individuals, no doubt about it. But religion can also be a source of anxiety, a big one too. So, for example, animistic cultures, a lot of them believe in sorcery. So there can be evil shamans or sorcerers who get spirits to harm you remotely. It's similar to belief in witchcraft. And even if a sorcerer is not trying to harm you, you may offend a spirit accidentally or intentionally, and then it could try to harm you in some way. And so, fear of being killed or given an illness or otherwise suffering misfortune from evil spirits and sorcerers, common feature of animistic religions, and it could be a source of anxiety, not coping. And you can even look at the monotheistic religions for something similar. So they may believe in witchcraft or demons as well, evil spirits that would harm you, but also just anxieties stemming from belief in an afterlife. So you might worry about going to hell, or you might worry about sins that you've committed, or wonder if you did commit a sin. So religion could open you up to new anxieties, even if it also serves as a partial coping mechanism. A third main type of definitional theory of religion are family resemblance theories of religion. And the term family resemblance is used by philosophers of language, to talk about certain types of concepts. The idea of a family resemblance concept was first developed by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And he was one of the first to notice, or at least to articulate meaningfully, the fact that a lot of words or concepts seem to lack an essence. So you can't actually define them in terms of a set of necessary and sufficient properties or conditions. And this was something of a shock when the implications of this were understood by other philosophers, because through most of the history of the philosophy, the goal was to come up with definitions in terms of a list of essential properties, in terms of a list of necessary and sufficient conditions for counting as a type of thing. And indeed, this is still what a lot of philosophers do. Now, keep in mind, there are concepts, like, for example, all the concepts in mathematics, some of the concepts in the sciences, that do have an essence and that can be defined in terms of necessary and sufficient properties. But Wittgenstein pointed out that most of our concepts don't actually work this way. The example used by Wittgenstein to illustrate family resemblance concept is games. There's a lot of different types of games, and they don't have necessary or sufficient properties. It doesn't seem like there's anything necessary for being a game. Some property like having dice or having a board or having cards that all games share. Nor is there a single property or condition that is sufficient for being a game. So even dice, for example, there are uses of dice that don't relate to games, like for divination, for instance. So you'd have to go through more examples of games to kind of prove the point, but it does illustrate very well this idea of a concept that has a definite meaning. We know what we mean when we use the word game, and others can understand it as well. And yet, the meaning cannot be defined through a list of essential properties. And Wittgenstein went on to use this example to make larger points in the philosophy of language and philosophy generally, but it also could be related to the concept of religion. Family resemblance concepts have a definite meaning, but they cannot be defined in terms of essential properties. So how do we define them? The concept of overlapping patterns of resemblance is useful here, and that is the idea that's suggested by the term family resemblance itself. Just as members of a family may not all have the same feature, they may not all have the same color of eyes, for example, and thus having that eye color is not a necessary property for being a member of the family. Yet they probably have traits or features that are very common among members of the family. And this illustrates the idea of family resemblance concept, that the concept doesn't give necessary or sufficient properties, but it gives you an idea of what traits the thing is likely to have. And you can use the traits that are common or salient and that kind of thing to assess the degree to which some individual fits the concept. For example, if you have dice, if you have a board, if you have cards, you are more gamey than if you didn't have those things. And it may apply both epistemologically and metaphysically. So you might say the more of those traits you have, the more likely you are to be a game in terms of probability, in terms of your degree of justification in believing something. Also, it could apply metaphysically. The more traits you have of that on that list, the more you are a game, the more you count as a game in terms of the type of thing you are. So regardless of how we want to interpret that, it could still be that these family resemblance concepts not only have definite meaning, but we could even work to spell out the meaning by giving lists of common features shared or even common goals. So for example, games are for the purpose of having fun, usually. They could be for the purpose of teaching or other things as well. But if you have the goals that you would expect of a game, as well as a lot of the other observable features like dice or a board or cards, the more of those you have, the more you count as a game, or the more likely it is you're a game, the more justified we're believing that the thing we're looking at is a game. So if we apply this family resemblance concept notion of Wittgenstein to religion, we could get theories like that of Ninian Smart. So he identifies 7 dimensions of religion. These are things that are not essential properties in his view, but they are what I would call salient properties. They're things that if you have them, you're more likely to count as a religion. So I listed 9 of these. Ninian Smart's list is a little bit different, but you can see there's a lot of overlap. Narrative mythological dimension, doctrinal dimension. This would include things like specific beliefs or doctrines about, for example, the sacred or the supernatural or the afterlife, etc. I left that one off my list just because some religions like Shinto, Japanese indigenous religion, and forms of animism, they're a bit light on doctrine. They tend to rely more on ritual or practice being performed a specific way, but these are not essential properties, so you don't have to have them to be a religion. And so, yeah, it's probably good pointing out the doctrinal element of religion as well. Ethical, institutional, that's referring to social institutions. Material, ritual, and experiential. So this is a Smart's attempt to list the salient or common properties we would expect to see in religions, but he would use that concept of Wittgenstein, the family resemblance concept as we term it, to emphasize that this is not a list of essential properties. Not every religion has to have all these things. And it's even conceivable, I guess, that you could have them all and not count as a religion, because he doesn't claim that they're jointly sufficient for being a religion either. And a final point made by the chapter is that religion can also serve as a marker of identity. So it's worth reflecting on that when we're trying to think of the definition or the nature of religion. Religion can be used to sort groups, to define the limits of a group identity. One example is Serbs, Bosnians, and Croats in southeastern Europe. They speak a similar language, so the main source of their group identity is not the language they speak, unlike some other ethnic groups, but rather their religious membership or the traditional religious membership of their families. That is the main marker of their ethnic identity. Serbs are traditionally Orthodox Christian, Bosnians are traditionally Muslim, and Croats are traditionally Roman Catholic Christian. So why might this be? Why might religion serve as a marker of group identity in a lot of cases? Well, if you think about some of the common properties of religion, the social, ritual, sacrificial, and moral aspects, a lot of those relate to groups or communities. So, for example, rituals can be performed by members of a community. And if you think about the case of Serbs, Bosnians, and Croats, they have different religions, so they would not be performing those rituals together. So one Croat might share a mass with another Croat, a Catholic mass, but they probably wouldn't do so with a Serb or a Bosnian. So there's going to be these ritual communities formed around the religions. And there's a lot more you could say about that, but hopefully that gives you some kind of indication of why religion is often a salient marker between different social groups. So that's going to wrap up our introductory chapter on defining religion. Next up, chapter 2, the anthropology of religion. We're going to go through a brief survey of that. So until next time.